Hey, I'm bankruptcy attorney Matt McCune. Welcome to the Bankruptcy Show, the show your creditors really don't want you to watch or listen to. We're going to break down the facts about debt and bankruptcy, showing you what your legal rights really are and giving you the information that you need to take care of yourself and your family. Let's get into today's episode. All right, let's get into it. We've talked about assets, exemptions, income and expenses. That's kind of the means test stuff. Bankruptcy generally is assets, debts, income, expenses. We haven't really covered yet. We haven't jumped deep into debt. So in this episode, I'm going to kind of do a broad overview of all the different types of debts that one can have and how that debt might be treated in a bankruptcy. So first and foremost, let's separate what are called secured debts from unsecured debts. Unsecured is pretty easy. That's your credit card, your personal loan, your line of credit, your affirm, medical bills, payday loans, all that sort of random stuff. Secured debt would be your home loan and car loan, right? So secured debts are going to get treated in a bankruptcy different than an unsecured debt. And a secured debt is a little bit more complicated, and there's really two parts to a secured debt. There's the promise to pay on a mortgage, we'll call that the note, and then there's a security interest that basically gives the bank extra protection in case you don't pay. And on a mortgage, we would call that the deed of trust. So the idea is when you're borrowing certain amounts of money, larger money, typically at better terms than unsecured debt, lower interest rates, there's going to need to be some extra protection for the lender. So, your mortgage rates are way better than your credit card rates, right? But you got to go through a long approval process. And then at the end of the day, if you don't pay your mortgage, well, they're going to take your fucking house because they have a security interest in the house. And so, and debts can actually be transferred from one category to another. So let's say my car got repoed, right? I owed 30 grand on a car. My car was way upside down like a lot of them are. Well, my car gets repoed. They sell it at auction for $10,000. Now I went from having a $30,000 secured debt on a car to now it got taken, sold at auction, got 10 grand. Now I owe them 20, and that is now an unsecured debt. So secured versus unsecured get treated differently. But the thing to understand is in the confines of a bankruptcy, you can wipe out all these debts, right? They can all go away. But if you don't pay the secured creditor, they're going to enforce their security interest and take back the asset. And that's commonly referred to a foreclosure on your house, a repossession on your car. So yeah, you can get out of the debt, but you're going to lose the asset. There is no free house or car in a bankruptcy. Now, we can work some magic and get you good deals, particularly in a Chapter 13, because in a Chapter 13, if the right fact pattern exists, I can modify the rights of certain creditors, like a car. So let's talk about the scenario where my car's worth 30, or I owe 30, my car's worth 10, I'm upside down $20,000. If the right fact pattern exists, I bought that car more than 2.5 years ago, I can modify the rights of that secured creditor. I can bifurcate the debt in a Chapter 13 bankruptcy and pay the value of the asset, 10 grand, and that 20,000 becomes an unsecured debt that's going to get discharged in my bankruptcy. Let's keep things high level for now. I want you to understand the difference between secured and unsecured. The credit cards, the medical bills, the lines of credit, the personal loans, these are the primary debts that most of us are looking for relief when we go into the bankruptcy system. And the presumption against those types of debts is that they are dischargeable. So secured, unsecured, we're going to get a little bit deeper into that in a sec. Let's talk about taxes. Okay, so taxes get super complicated, and taxes can fall into a couple different categories. You can have a secured tax debt. That'd be a tax lien. Like if you don't pay, the IRS, it takes a while for them to do this, but they'll go way back and they'll get a lien and they'll record that lien, and that lien attaches to all your property. So that would be a scenario where you have a tax lien. The more common way that we categorize taxes in a bankruptcy are into priority and non-priority. So generally speaking, taxes are considered priority if they were filed in the last 3 years, right? So, and that date is determined based on the tax filing date. So, as of April 15th, right? So, let's say you were in March or March 1 of 2026, right? So, the tax priority years as of March 1, 2026 would be 25, 24, 23, and 22. It's actually 4 years back. But once we get past the tax filing deadline, right now now we're in April 16th of 2026. So now 25, 24, and 23 are the priority years. 22 fell off at the tax filing date. So now there are things that could actually bump that tax up into priority status. Maybe you got an extension. The taxes are incredibly complicated, and bankruptcy attorneys are confused about it. We've all got this book, the King Bible is what we call it, that help us figure out all these issues. So the big picture understanding, let's just talk about Chapter 7. If I owe priority taxes in Chapter 7, they're not going to go away. They're going to be waiting for me out. They're going to survive the discharge, right? And there's 3 big rules that would bump them into that status. 1, they're owed for the last 3 years. 2, even if they're outside of 2 years, if you filed the taxes, if they're outside of the 3-year period, if you filed them within 2 years of the filing of your case, that can bump them up. And then if they get assessed within 240 days of the case filing, see what I'm saying? This shit is tricky, and there's a lot of pitfalls to fall into, so you got to be careful about your taxes. So in a Chapter 7, my priority taxes are going to survive the bankruptcy discharge. In a Chapter 13, I'm actually going to have to pay them back through the plan, through the bankruptcy trustee, to get my discharge. And you get to stop some interest penalties and that sort of stuff. But the interest on the taxes for those priority taxes that are being paid through Chapter 13 can actually still run. And it takes the IRS forever to figure this out. Look, taxes are super complicated in bankruptcy. I mean, generally a lot of people are like, well, I just assume I can't get out of taxes in a bankruptcy. And that's not true. Okay, that's definitely not true, especially if they're older than 3 years, you filed them on time, there was no fraud involved in your tax returns, and they haven't been assessed recently. You can wipe those damn things out. Before 2005, there was this thing, we used to call Chapter 13 discharge the super discharge. You wouldn't believe the shit you could get out of in a Chapter 13 before October of 2005, but I guess that was a long time ago. So taxes are tricky. We've talked about secured, unsecured. We've talked about taxes. Let's talk about some weird stuff. Student loans. Okay. Student loans are not priority debts, but they kind of almost might as well be. But there's some nuances to it. So I file a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. My student loans are going to survive. So whether they're priority or not, it doesn't matter. The technical term is they are accepted from discharge. Assume a debt goes away in a bankruptcy unless it falls into a category, right? And in Chapter 7, one of those categories would be priority taxes. In another category would be student loans unless it imposes an undue hardship on the debtor. I'm going to have the next episode, the next 1 or 2 episodes is going to be with one of the best attorneys in Colorado. She's amazing, and she understands the student loan shit inside and out. So we're going to give you some good info on student loans here in a coming episode. But for 7 purposes, a student loan's kind of like, whatever. It's a priority debt, not priority. Doesn't matter. It's accepted from discharge. Same thing. Tomato, tomato. In Chapter 13, the difference is important because it's not a priority debt, right? You don't have to pay your student loans back through the Chapter 13 to get your discharge, but they're not going away. Right? So they'll be waiting for you. And look, what's happening right now is the government's getting a lot more aggressive about collection on student loan debt. Some people have been known, I've done it. We've put, there had to be some other debt, some reason, but some people have filed a Chapter 13 just to buy time protection from the student loan creditors. Because think about it, if you got major student loan problems and you can hide out in a bankruptcy for 5 years, well, you might just be able to wait until the next administration is in office, because what happens in this country, unfortunately, is the pendulum swings wildly depending on who's in power. So right now in 2025, it's a challenging environment. And so people are starting to get garnished for student loans when they haven't been in a long time. So those are the big categories. Now let's get into some even more technicalities, right? So domestic support obligation is a type of debt that gets special treatment. And the presumption is you're never going to get out of your domestic support obligations, right? Nor should you, really. You need to pay your child support. You need to pay your alimony. Some nuances in Chapter 13 where, domestic support obligations like kind of court ordered from your state divorce or, separation proceeding related to alimony, child support, that sort of stuff. There are often property settlements within your divorce from the state court. And in a Chapter 13, you might actually be able to get out of that property settlement in a 13. I don't love dealing with it. People going through divorce are not in their right mind. They're terrible clients, and I'll only take them on in a limited number of times, and they have to prove to me that they're going to be rational about it. But domestic support obligation is a special debt. In 7, you're never going to get out of it. If you're not current on your child support obligations, your domestic support obligation in Chapter 7, technically you have no exemptions. We haven't really seen the trustees, at least in Colorado, enforce much of that, where they're selling your junky truck or whatever to pay your DSO. In Chapter 13, you have to get current. You have to catch it up, maintain your normal payments. Basically, you have to prove you're cool in the gang with your DSO before you can get a discharge into Chapter 13. So those are, different categories: secured, unsecured, taxes, student loans, domestic support obligations, and then there's all these other things that come into there as well. This is a bankruptcy show, so we're talking about debts that ultimately might survive a bankruptcy or how they get treated. And so one thing we need to talk about is debts incurred through fraud. Because so I go bankrupt, I list all my creditors, right? I list all my assets, I go through the process. Let's say I'm doing a Chapter 7. A month after I file, I've got my creditor meeting, and then there's a deadline. There's a 60-day deadline after that meeting of creditors, and that's the deadline for a debt that would otherwise be dischargeable, for that creditor to contest the dischargeability of the debt. And why would they do that? Fraud, right? Fraudulently incurred debts are non-dischargeable in a bankruptcy. Now, the presumption is the debt is ultimately discharged unless it's over a certain number really close to the filing. That's an unusual fact pattern. Tell your lawyer if you've been stupid with your credit cards right before you go bankrupt. Don't do it. It's a bad idea. But like we're seeing this with some of these merchant cash advances. These jokers are now getting real aggressive about objecting to these debts being discharged in a bankruptcy. And the idea is, look, if you lie to your creditor when you get the loan, right, they weren't put in a situation where they could make a rational decision about whether they should extend that credit to you. So if you incur the debt through fraudulent means, and the creditor will ultimately have to show that most of the time, that is also a debt that would be non-dischargeable in a bankruptcy. Look, this stuff is complicated, right? I mean, this is what I'm talking about. This is why you need to hire a very high quality, competent attorney. I can always help you find somebody. But those, for the most part, are the big, broad categories of debts that I want you to be aware of as you're exploring your bankruptcy options and trying to get some questions answered about, because bankruptcy will affect a debt differently depending on the nature of the debt. Hey, have a great day. I can't wait for the next show. I'm excited about the student loan episode coming up soon. That's going to be some high-level, super valuable knowledge. Have a great day.